Section 21 of Greece and the Allies by George Frederick Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mario Pineda. Chapter 19. Monsieur Jonard celebrated his triumph with yet another proclamation by which he assured the Greek people that the guaranteeing powers were there to restore constitutional verity and the regular working of constitutional institutions, that all reprisals against Greeks, to whatever party they might belong, would be ruthlessly repressed, that the liberty of everybody would be safeguarded, that the protecting powers, respectful of the people's sovereignty, had no intention of imposing a mobilization upon it. The sincerity of these professions was soon brought to the test. While penning them, Monsieur Jonard had before him two lists of persons marked down for reprisals. The first contained 30 victims, foremost among them Monsieur Gunaris, General Dusmanis, and Colonel Metaxas. Mr. Strait had anticipated his doom by accompanying his sovereign into exile. These were deported to Corsica. The second list comprised 130 persons, 2 ex-premiers, Messrs. Esculudis and Lambros, 6 ex-ministers of state, 1 general, 1 admiral, other officers of high rank, lawyers, publicists, who were to be placed under surveillance. The king's 3 brothers, Princes Nicholas, Andrew, and Christopher, were banished with their families to Switzerland. In addition, certain individuals of lower classes who had participated in the events of 1 and 2 December and whose culpability was vouched for by the French Secret Service were to be arrested and brought to book. Monsieur Jonard, forbidden by his diplomatic art from meddling openly in the internal affairs of the country, caused his epuration to be carried out through Mr. Samis. It was hard for the poor premier to expel fellow citizens who had occupied eminent positions and with whom he had been in close relations, not to mention the flagrant illegality of such a proceeding. But how could he hope to argue successfully against a man who, under the appearances of a scrupulous conscience, recognized no law? So it came that, after a long interview on board the Justice 16 June, Mr. Samis fell in with Monsieur Jonard's wish. The rapid fulfillment of the no reprisals pledge was declared necessary to make Athens safe for the Allies. It certainly was indispensable to make it safe for Mr. Venizelos, whose immediate return, by a modification of the original plan, had been resolved upon. The French, finding things composed into tranquillity much sooner than they anticipated, saw no cause for delay. Was it not a fact that whenever the High Commissioner visited the capital, he met with nothing but respect, sympathy, and cries of "Vive la France"? It was, in all ages, from the time of the Roman consul Flamininus onwards, there have been found Greeks loving liberators more than liberty. But Mr. Venizelos knew better. Whilst at Salonica, he used to assure his western friends that the great majority of Athens remained Venizelist. If proof be desired, it is only necessary to organize a referendum, subject of course to guarantees of impartiality. Let the king and his satellites be put aside for the moment, let controllers be appointed from all countries, and let the people be asked to vote freely. I am sure of a great majority, let them take me at my word. When, however, the king and his satellites were about to be put aside, Mr. Venizelos, as we have seen, had stipulated for some months of delay, and now that they had been put aside, he still felt that a partial epuration did not suffice for his safety. No doubt, the bayonets which had pulled the king down were able to set him up. But Mr. Venizelos, for reasons both personal and patriotic, shrank from leaning on foreign bayonets more than was unavoidable. He had no desire to justify the nickname bestowed upon him months ago of Archos Negalisos, chief of the Senegalese, an epithet conveying the suggestion that he aimed at turning Greece into a dependency of France. Monsieur Jonard seemed to share this laudable delicacy. General Sarrail, however, cared nothing for appearances, but itched to get Mr. Venizelos out of Salonica at the earliest possible moment. His first favorable impression of the Cretan as somebody had not survived closer acquaintance. He considered him wanting in courage. He had no patience with his hesitations. He felt, in short, no more respect for him than men usually feel for their tools, and since he had never learned to put any restraint on his tongue, he expressed his opinion of this ex-revolutionary transformed into a government man freely. The Greek was too discreet to say what he thought of the Frenchman, but as he was not less vain and domineering, their intercourse at Salonica had been the reverse of harmonious. Note: Sarrail, pages 102, 153, 234-35. One of their quarrels arose from the fact that General Sarrail claimed the entire jurisdiction over the inhabitants of the country, many of whom he had reported to France as suspects, and refused to give them up to the courts competent to deal with them. End of note. Thus, the leader of the Liberals found himself brought back to the city from which he had been prodded 9 months before. He arrived on board the French warship of the Piraeus on 21st June, but he gave out that he did not intend to come to Athens or to call himself to power. An agreement, he said, had been reached between Monsieur Donat and Mr. Samis to the effect that a mixed ministerial commission should be formed to negotiate the unification of the country. That was true. With his usual sense of propriety, the High Commissioner would not dream of usurping the place of the acknowledged chiefs of the Greek people. It was for them to take the initiative. The guaranteeing powers which he represented respected the national will too much to dictate the terms of the fusion between the two sections into which Greece had been so unfortunately divided. Therefore, he invited the heads of the two governments, Mr. Samis and Mr. Venizelos, to enter into direct conversations, he offering to act as a simple adviser, mediator, at most arbitrator. Both seized on the invitation. The main question had already been settled between Monsieur Donat and Mr. Venizelos. The latter should return to power at once, but legally he could only return by a parliamentary election, and as he could not hope for a majority, neither he nor Monsieur Donat wanted an election. It was accordingly decided that, since no reliance could be placed on the popular will of the present, an appeal should be made to the popular will of the past. The Chamber on 13 June 1915, in which Mr. Venizelos had a majority, should be recalled to life on the ground that its dissolution, in their opinion, was illegal. This decision, so well calculated to preserve externals with all the reverence which expediency permitted, was on 24 June formally conveyed by the High Commissioner to Mr. Samis, who, doing what was expected of him, tendered his resignation. The High Commissioner thanked him and promptly obtained from King Alexander a declaration that he was ready to entrust the government to Mr. Venizelos, who only asked for a delay of 2 days to fetch his cabinet from Salonica. Meanwhile, the news that Mr. Venizelos was coming had spread, and the return at that delicate moment of the yacht Sphacteria, which had carried King Constantine away, added fuel to the flame. In the evening, 24 June, the crew of the boat, joined by students and reservists, paraded the streets with a portrait of the king and cried, "Long live Constantine!" The column of demonstrators grew as it went along, the police being unable or unwilling to check it. Without a doubt, Mr. Venizelos was right. The epuration of the capital had not gone far enough. To prevent surprises, General Regnault, commander of the landing forces, immediately took the measures which he had carefully planned in advance. By dawn of 25th June, French troops with artillery had occupied all the heights round the town. They were to stay there as long as Mr. Venizelos wanted them, and perhaps even longer. Note: Donat, pages 176-78, 199-201. The Italians who had stepped into Epirus only evacuated it when they made sure that their allies were quitting Thessaly and Attica. End of note. Under such conditions, the people's chosen formed his ministry, 26 June, and nerved himself to face the people. Every preparation for his entry into the capital had been made. Nothing remained but to fix the hour. But this he evaded, doing in a manner which puzzled and exasperated the French general. It was the goal towards which they had moved steadily and methodically, step tracing step, through so many weary months, the ground of their joint adventure. Why then did he not seize it? Why did he shrink from possession? What did he mean by it? The general did not know, but he felt that it would not do. "Monsieur le Président," he said to him incisively, "here you are in power. It is up to you to assume the responsibility. I have the force in my hands, and it is my business to secure your installation in Athens. But I must have your instructions. Tell me what measures you want me to take." The request was a command. Mr. Venizelos thanked the general effusively, pressing his hands. "After all," he said, "it is certain that people will always say that I did not return to Athens, but with the support of the allies." Finally, it was arranged that he should land in the forenoon of 27 June. An ordeal which could not be avoided ought not to be postponed. At the appointed hour, the French troops entered Athens with their machine guns and occupied the principal points along the route by which Mr. Venizelos was to proceed, while the vicinity of the royal palace, where he was to take the oath of office, and the interior of it were watched by 400 Cretan gendarmes, his faithful bodyguard, come from Salonika. Notwithstanding all these precautions, Mr. Venizelos and his ministers, modestly averse from exposing themselves to the enthusiasm of their fellow citizens, motored at top speed straight to the palace, eschewing the central thoroughfares, and thence to the Hotel Grand Bretagne, in the corridors of which also Cretan stalwarts mounted guard. Thanks to this vigilance, as General Renaud observes, the assassins whom the Premier and his friends feared to see rise from every street corner, and even in the passages of the palace and hotel, had not materialized. But Mr. Venizelos, where his own life was concerned, took no chances. A Cretan regiment from Salonika landed that afternoon to replace the foreign battalions. Towards evening, a demonstration organized in the square before the hotel gave Mr. Venizelos an opportunity of appearing on the balcony and making an eloquent speech. He reminded his hearers how the last warning he had addressed to King Constantine from the balcony of his house 10 months ago had been disregarded, and how, in consequence, the part of the nation still healthy had risen to save the rest. The cure thus begun would go on until it had wrought out its accomplishment. In due time, a constituent assembly would be elected to revise the constitution so as to place beyond peradventure the sovereignty of the people. Meanwhile, the national system had been singularly enfeebled and corrupted by the late autocratic regime. The public services did not do their work as they ought. Impurities had crept into the blood. The body politic needed purging. He would put all this right. He would restore the system to vigorous activity. Every impurity would be cleansed from it, and pure, refreshed blood would circulate all over the body politic, giving health to every fiber of the state. As to matters external, he thought it needless to say that the place of Greece was by the side of the powers who fought for democracy. The next 2 days saw this program at work. A rupture of relations with the Central Empires, to be followed by a mobilization, marked the end of Greek neutrality. King Alexander, as yet a novice in statecraft, expressed surprise at the inconsistency between these acts and the repeated assurances given to the Greek people. He was told that the accession of Mr. Venizelos could mean nothing else but war. His Majesty knew it. Having accepted Venizelos, he must accept his foreign policy. Not less was the young king's shock at another act of the new government, the suspension by a royal decree of the irremovability of judges, which is expressly guaranteed by the Constitution. "They accuse my father of violating the Constitution," he said to M. Junard, "and the first thing they ask me to do is to violate it." So acute an interpreter of constitutional law could have small difficulty in disposing of these scruples. He explained to the young monarch that he could sign the decree without any compunction. The Constituent Assembly, which would be elected by and by to revise the Constitution, would legitimize everything. He went on to give him a little, simple lecture on the elements of constitutional verity, its theory and its practice. In a short time, he concluded suavely, "Your Majesty will know on this subject as much as any of your ministers." Whenever he experienced the need of further instruction, he only had to call the High Commissioner, who promised to come and solve his perplexities in a trice. The soundness of the instruction might be questionable, but the source from which it came gave it unquestionable weight. By the time M. Junard left Athens, 7 July, he had every reason to feel gratified at the complete success of his efforts. France's protégé was installed at the head of the Hellenic nation, ready to lead it forth by her side. The regular working of constitutional institutions was assured, and the foundations of a democratic government were well and truly laid. In all history, it would be difficult to find a more signal instance of brute force and bad faith triumphing in the name of law and verity. End of section 21. Section 22 of Greece and the Allies by George Frederick Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mario Pineda. Chapter 20. It is not my intention to give a minute and consecutive account of the abnormal state which prevailed in Greece during a period of more than 3 years. I will for once flatter its authors by imitating their summary methods. Mr. Venizelos, hating monarchy, yet unable to dispense with it, despising democracy, yet obliged to render it lip homage, maintained his own unlimited power by the same system of apparent liberty and real violence by which he had attained it. The semblance of a free constitution was preserved in all its forms. Crown, parliament, press continued to figure as heretofore. But each only served to clothe the skeleton of a dictatorship as absolute as that of any Caesar. King Alexander, without experience or character, weak, frivolous, and plastic, obediently signed every decree presented to him. When recourse to the legislature was thought necessary, the chamber perfunctorily passed every bill submitted to it. The newspapers were tolerated as long as they refrained from touching on essentials. At the very opening of Parliament, for so we must call this illegitimate assembly, the king, in a speech from the throne written by Mr. Venizelos, expounded his master's policy, external and internal. Externally, Greece had spontaneously offered her feeble forces to that belligerent group whose war aims were to defend the rights of nationalities and the liberties of peoples. Internally, she would have to be purified by the removal of the staunchest adherents of the old regime from positions of trust and influence. But neither of these operations could be carried out save under the reign of terror known as martial law. Parliament, therefore, voted martial law, and Mr. Venizelos, irritated by the arbitrary proceedings of the opposition, which protested against the restrictions on public opinion, emphasized the fact that the government was determined to act with an iron hand and to crush any attempt at reaction. Never was promise more faithfully kept. Within the chamber, it soon became a parliamentary custom to refute by main force. Sometimes liberal deputies volunteered for this service. Sometimes it was performed by the captain of the premier's Cretan guard, who of course had no seat in the house, but who held a revolver in his hand. Out of Parliament, the iron hand made itself felt through the length and breadth of the country. With a view to purging and uplifting the judiciary body and securing justice from political interference, all the courts were swept clean of royalist magistrates, whose places were filled with members of the Liberal Party. In this way, the pernicious connection between the judicial and political powers, abolished in 1909, perhaps the most beneficial achievement of the Reconstruction era, was re-established, and Venizelism became an indispensable qualification for going to law with any chance of obtaining justice. An equally violent passion for purity led at the same time, and by a process as unconstitutional as it was uncanonical, to ecclesiastical reforms, whereby the Holy Synod was deposed and an extraordinary disciplinary court was erected to deal with the clerical enemies of the new regime, especially with the prelates who took part in the anathematization of Mr. Venizelos. Only 5 bishops were found in all Greece competent or compliant enough to sit on this tribunal. The other 7 came from Macedonia, Crete, and Mytilene. Those dioceses were under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople, whose sanction was neither asked nor given. With the exception of 6, 5 of whom belonged to the disciplinary court, all the prelates of the kingdom were struck by it. Some were degraded and turned out to subsist as they might, on charity or by the sale of their holy vestments. Others were sentenced to humiliating punishments, and where no plausible excuse for a trial could be discovered, exile or confinement was inflicted arbitrarily. On the other hand, as many as repented received plenary absolution. For instance, the bishops of Demetrias and Gitium were deprived for having cursed Mr. Venizelos, but on promise in future to preach the gospel according to him, they were not only pardoned, but nominated members of the second disciplinary court, created to continue the purification of the Church. Even more instructive was the case of the Metropolitan of Castoria, who was tried, convicted, and confined in a monastery, but after recanting his political heresies, was retried, unanimously acquitted, and reinstated. All this in the words of the Speech from the Throne, to restore the prestige of the Church. Side by side went on the reform of every branch of the administration. All the prefects and many lesser functionaries were discharged. Schoolmasters and schoolmistresses were dismissed by the 100. The National University, the National Library, the National Museum, the National Bank underwent a careful disinfection. In every department, the worst traditions of the spoils system prevalent before 1909 were revived and reinvigorated. Other measures marked an improvement on tradition. Some 2,000 Army and Navy officers, from generals and admirals downwards, were put on the retired list or under arrest. And an almost hysterical desire manifested itself to strike terror into every civilian whom his opinions rendered objectionable and his position dangerous to the new order. Tactics the full brutality of which was revealed in the treatment of Mr. Venizelos' principal adversaries. Mr. Rufus, a former cabinet minister, languished in the Aberov jail from 1917 until the spring of 1920, when the Athenian newspapers announced his release. About the same time, Mr. Esslin, an ex-president of the chamber, who had been imprisoned at the age of 78 in the Singers jail, was released by death. All the members of the Skouloudis cabinet, with the exception of Admiral Konduriotis, Minister of Marine, who had afterwards proved his patriotism by enlisting under the Cretan's banner, were arraigned for high treason, referring mainly to the surrender of Fort Rappel. The preliminary examination dragged on from year to year and produced only evidence which established the innocence of the accused. Note, it also brought to light documents of real historic value, such as the dispatches included in the White Book, numbers 70 following. End of note. One of them, ex-Premier Rallis, in April 1920, after being for years libeled as a traitor, suddenly found himself exempted by royal decree from further persecution because at that time Mr. Venizelos conceived the hope that this statesman might be induced to undertake the leadership of an opposition accepting his regime. The rest, particularly Mr. Skouloudis and Mr. Dragoumis, one aged 82 and the other 77, after a long confinement in the Evangelismos hospital, remained to the end under strict surveillance, with gendarmes guarding their houses and dogging their footsteps. The Lambros cabinet was similarly harassed until one of its members turned Venizelist and 3 others died. Among the latter, Mr. Lambros himself and his Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Salocostas. Both these gentlemen, though in poor health, had been confined on desolate islets of the archipelago, where they were kept without proper medical attendance or any of the comforts which their condition required, and were only brought home to expire. In each case, and also in that of the soldiers responsible for the surrender of the Kavala garrison, whose treasonable conduct became likewise the subject of judicial investigation, trial was sedulously deferred by a variety of ingenious contrivances, nothing being more remote from the government's mind than the intention to draw the truth into the light. The motive of these proceedings doubtless was one of policy chiefly, to ruin the enemies of the regime in public esteem by branding them as traitors, even if no conviction could be obtained. But policy was not the only element. To judge by the harshness displayed, there was the personal factor, too. Mr. Venizelos had had a feud with these men and had vanquished them. They were men who, all things considered, it was more a shame to fight than an honor to vanquish, and they were humbled, they were in his power. For the proud spirit that would have been enough, it was not enough for Mr. Venizelos. He acted as if he wanted to enjoy their humiliation, and because he had them down to profit by their helplessness. Identical treatment could not be meted out to those in Corsica and Switzerland, though some of them were sentenced to death by default for conspiring against Mr. Venizelos. But all that could be done from a distance to embitter their lot was done. Whilst at home the blackest calumnies were thrown upon them, in exile they were pursued by the same blight. Special attention was directed to the arch-traitor. He had been dethroned and expatriated, but this was not enough. His pension was cut off. He and all the members of his family, with the exception of Prince George, who stayed in Paris, were forbidden to visit Entente countries, even for the purpose of attending the deathbed of a relative. Entente subjects visiting Switzerland were forbidden to go near them, lest any particle of the truth should percolate. Until the end of the war, they lived segregated, shunned, and spied upon like malefactors. During the liberal regime in Greece, while Italian and Swiss hotels flourished all year round, or royalist refugees, royalist exiles populated the semi-desert islands of the archipelago. They were gathered in batches and shipped off, persons of every degree, from general officers whose guilt was attachment to their king, down to poor people convicted of owning the king's portrait. For the possession of the portrait of Constantine, supplied one of the most common proofs of ill will towards the established order. This mania gaffa tu katestotos, a new crime invented to meet a new constitutional situation. It extended to the utmost confines of the kingdom. As the farmers were at work in the fields, gendarmes raided and ransacked their cottages for such portraits. Butchers and fishmongers were haled before courts-martial for like indications of ill will. And matter for laughter and matter for tears are inseparable in modern Greek history, perhaps in all history. One met a cabman beaten again and again for calling his horse Kotso, diminutive of Constantine, or a woman dragged to the police station because her parrot was heard whistling the Constantine march. Volumes would be needed to record the petty persecutions which arose from the use of that popular name. Suffice it to say that prudent parents refrained from giving it to their children. If enemies had to be frightened by every exhibition of severity, it was no less imperative to gratify friends by every mark of generosity. As already noted, a mixed commission had been appointed under the old regime to identify out of the public purse the Venizelos who suffered during the Athens disturbances of 1 and 2 December 1916. This body, after the expulsion of the king, was remodeled by the substitution of a Venizelist for the royalist Greek member, was authorized to enlarge its purview so as to cover all losses occasioned, directly or indirectly, by royalist resentment throughout the kingdom throughout the 6 months' blockade, including even the cases of persons who, compelled to flee the country, were torpedoed in the course of their voyage, and was invested with powers to decide unfettered by any legislation or by any obligation to give reasons for these decisions. Thanks to their unlimited scope and discretion, the commissioners, after rejecting some 2,500 claims as fraudulent, were still able to admit 3,350 claims and to allot damages representing a total sum of just under 7 million drachmas. The number of all adherents confirmed in the faith through this expedient, however, was as nothing to the legions of proselytes won by the creation of new government posts of every grade in every part of the kingdom, by the facilities afforded in the transaction of all business over which the state had any control, which under existing conditions meant all important business, and by the favors of various sorts that were certain to reward devotion to the cause. Besides the steadily growing swarm of native parasites, profiteers, jobbers, and adventurers who throve on the spoils of the public, marched a less numerous, but not less ravenous, host of foreign financiers, concession and contract hunters, to whom the interests of the state were freely bartered for support to the party in the Entente capitals. The economic exhaustion caused by this reckless waste of national wealth, in addition to the necessary war expenditure, was concealed at the time partly by credits furnished to Mr. Venizelos in Paris and London, and partly by an artificial manipulation of the exchange for his sake. It became apparent when these political influences ceased to interfere with the normal working of financial laws. Then the Greek exchange, which at the outbreak of the European war stood at 26 or 27 drachmas to the pound sterling, and later was actually against London, dropped to 65, and by a rapid descent reached the level of 155. Thus, in the domain of finance, as in every other, the valuable reconstructive achievement of 1909, which had led to the transformation of a deficit of from 10 to 12 millions into a surplus of 15 millions, and to the accumulation of deposits that enabled the Greek exchange to withstand the shock of several conflicts, was demolished by its own architect. The illusion that Mr. Venizelos had the nation behind him was diligently kept up by periodical demonstrations organized on his behalf. Joy bells announced to the Athenians his homecomings from abroad. The destitute refugees harbored at the Piraeus were given some pocket money and a free ticket to attend him up to the capital. The cafes at the bidding of the police disgorged their loafers into the streets, and the army of genuine partisans, thus augmented with auxiliaries, accorded their chief a reception calculated to impress newspaper readers in France and England. But observers on the spot knew that the national enthusiasm was as hollow as a drum, which under the manipulation of an energetic minority could be made to emit a considerable amount of noise, that the demonstrators to a large extent were a stage crowd which could be moved rapidly from place to place and round the same place repeatedly, that since the schism the great Cretan had loomed small in his own country, and that he had grown less by his elevation. Such terrorism of opponents and favoritism of adherents, such encouragement of oppression and connivance at corruption, Such a prostitution of justice, such a cynical indifference to all moral principle, unparalleled even in the history of Greece, could not but make the Cretans' rule both odious and despicable. What made it more hateful still in the eyes of the people was the fact that it had been imposed upon them by foreign arms, and what made it more contemptible still was the fact that it functioned under false pretenses. As free men, the Greeks resented the violence done to their liberty, but as intelligent men they would have resented open violence less than a profanation of the name of liberty that added mockery to injury and administered a daily affront to their intelligence. There was yet a spirit of resistance in the country which would not be crushed, and a fund of good sense which could not be deceived. If they formerly anathematized Mr. Venizelos as a traitor, the masses now execrated him as a tyrant, a mean and crafty bully without bowels of mercy, who gave license to his followers to commit every species of oppression and exploitation in the interest of party. Such were the feelings with which the very name of Venizelos inspired the mass of the people. And that the mass of the people was in the main right can scarcely be contested. It would, of course, be absurd to hold Mr. Venizelos directly responsible for every individual act of oppression and corruption, most of which occurred during his absences from the country, and of which he was not cognizant. But it was he who had initiated both oppression and corruption. M. Junot's prescriptive lists were really Mr. Venizelos's, who had long since made his own enemies pass for enemies of the Entente. The purification of the public services, as well as the prosecutions, the imprisonments and deportations of eminent personages, some of whom died of the hardships and privations they underwent, were his own doing. The multiplication of offices and officials began with his creation at the very outset of 2 new ministries, a measure to which even King Alexander demurred when the list of Mr. Venizelos' cabinet was presented to him. Nor is there upon record a single case in which the chief seriously attempted either to restrain or to punish his subordinates. In truth, he was not free to do so. He was bound to the system he had brought into being, and was irretrievably committed to all its works. A man who gains supreme power against the wishes of the majority, and only with the consent of a faction, cannot maintain himself in it except by force and bribery. He must coerce and corrupt. Moreover, to rule without a rival, he must surround himself with men vastly inferior to him both in talent and in virtue, men who, in return for their obsequious servility, must be humored and satisfied. Whenever such a usurpation occurs, all the maxims upon which the welfare and freedom of a community normally rest are annihilated, and the reign of profligacy and of tyranny inevitably supervenes. A regime born in party passion must live for purely party ends. We may break or circumvent all laws, save the eternal and immutable law of cause and effect. Note, there have been usurpers like Oliver Cromwell who managed to temper tyranny with probity, but their cases are exceptional and their success only a matter of degree. End of note. The best of Mr. Venizelos' followers sincerely regretted the unceasing persecution of their adversaries. They saw that stability could not be attained without conciliation and cooperation, but they did not see how clemency could be combined with safety. The thousands of officers and officials who had been turned out of their posts, and the politicians who were kept out of office found employment, and the private individuals who had suffered for their ill will towards the established order relief in plotting and intriguing. There was so much unrest that the authorities had to use severe measures. Mr. Venizelos himself wished to make his administration milder and cleaner and to broaden its basis. He was even credited with the one joke of his life in this connection. "I will yet head anti-Venizelism." But the thing was beyond his power. He had not a sufficient following in the country to replace armed force, and he dared not trust the royalists with a share in the government for fear lest they should use it against them. None indeed was more painfully conscious of the hate for him which every month increased in the breasts of his countrymen than Mr. Venizelos himself. From the very beginning of the schism, he had assumed a prophylactic in the form of a cuirass. Note, an article of this kind was found in his house after the fighting of 2 December 1916. End of note. And since his installation he neglected none of the precautions requisite for his personal security. During his rare sojourns in Athens, he always went about escorted by his Cretan guards. while on the roof of a building facing his house stood 2 machine guns for, as a witty Athenian informed an inquisitive stranger, the protection of minorities. In general, it is true, the plotting and intriguing which permeated the country were too fatuous to be dangerous. But every now and then they took on formidable shape. In November 1919, a carefully organized military conspiracy at Athens only miscarried through the indiscretion of a trusty but tipsy sergeant. Among the letters intercepted and produced at the trial was one from a royalist exiled in Italy to another at home. The writer, a lady, reported her brother as wondering how anybody in Greece could fail to understand that there no longer existed such things as a government and an opposition, but only tyrants and tyrannized over, who worked, the former to maintain their arbitrary authority, the latter to shake it off and recover their liberty. The work of neither could, in the nature of things, be carried on according to any constitutional rule or law. He went on to argue that, under such conditions, deeds which could otherwise be crimes were justified and even glorified by history as unavoidable fulfillments of a patriotic duty. Force must be met with force. So the national demoralization inaugurated by foreign pressure went on being promoted by domestic tyranny, and of cure there was no hope. Good men would not associate themselves with the Venizelos regime because it was bad, and even men by no means notorious for goodness shunned it, not because it was bad, but because they were sure enough to perceive it was too bad to last. End of section 22. Section 23 of Greece and the Allies by George Frederick Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mario Pineda. Chapter 21. The liberal regime, having few roots in the soil and those rotten, could not but be ephemeral unless the external force that had planted continued to uphold it, in which case Mr. Venizelos might have lived to weep over the triumph of his cause and the ruin of his country. This contingency, however, was eliminated in advance by the clashing ambitions of the Allies, the real guarantee of Greek independence. Foreign interference, made possible by the war, had to cease with it. And that was not all. Monsieur Ribot, on 16 July 1917, had declared in the French Senate that the changes brought about in Greece would have to be ratified by a Greek National Assembly. Mr. Venizelos also had, as we saw, stated on his advent that the 1915 chamber was but a temporary solution, that in due time a constituent assembly would be elected to settle matters, a statement which he repeated shortly afterwards in Parliament. The representatives of the nation, he said, watch with perfect calmness the internal evolution of the political life of the country and wait for the removal of the obstacles which do not permit the immediate convocation of the National Assembly that will lay definitely the basis of the state. After nearly 3 years of internal evolution, the time for the redemption of these pledges seemed to the people overdue. In vain did Mr. Venizelos endeavor to put off the day of trial by arguing that it was advisable to avoid the agitation inseparable from an election whilst Greece was still at war with Turkey, and by promising that the elections would follow close upon the signature of peace. It was natural that he should adopt this course. He could not but hope that the fruits of his foreign policy, fruits never even dreamt of a few years before, would reconcile the people to his domestic administration. It was equally natural that the people should be impatient. Turkey may not sign peace for ages, they protested. Meanwhile, are we to go on living under martial law? They demanded the dissolution of the illegal and, at best, long superannuated chamber and fresh elections. The call for freedom grew louder, more insistent, more imperious and dangerous, until Mr. Venizelos took a first tentative step towards a return to normality. On 6 May 1920, the day of the publication of the Turkish peace terms granted by the Allies at San Remo, a royal decree was issued at Athens abolishing martial law. As at a signal, the press turned its searchlights on the inroads made into the Constitution. Abuses and excesses hitherto held back by the censorship gained publicity. Political groups started organizing themselves for the electoral contest, with every grievance of the past as an incitement to action in the future. Most disturbing manifestation of all, though one that might have been foretold, streets and taverns resounded again with the song in which King Constantine was referred to as the son of the eagle, leading his army to glory. Evidently, the efforts to root up loyalism had not succeeded, far from it. While Mr. Venizelos grew less by his elevation, King Constantine was raised by his humiliation to a condition, if not actually divine, halfway towards divinity. In many a house his portrait stood among the holy icons, with a light burning before it, and the peasants worshipped it, much as their pagan ancestors would have done. It was but the culmination of a process long at work, a process in which the historical element was strangely mingled with the mythical. Note: there is always so much of mystery surrounding the peasant mind that its workings must often be accepted rather than understood. But those who wish to understand somewhat the psychological process which led in antiquity to the deification of kings during their lifetime could not do better than study the cult of Constantine among the modern Greek peasantry. End of note. Since the Balkan Wars, King Constantine had been identified in the peasant mind with the last Byzantine Venizelos, his namesake, Constantine Paleologus, slain by the Turks in 1453, who, according to a widely believed legend, lay in an enchanted sleep waiting for the hour when he should wake, break with his sword the chains of slavery, and replant the cross on the dome of Saint Sophia. This singular fancy, whether a case of resurrection or of reincarnation is not clear, was strengthened by the fact that his fall occurred on the very anniversary, 29 May, 11 June, of the day on which the unfortunate emperor fell in the ramparts of Constantinople. The coincidence completed the association between the monarch who sacrificed his life to save his people from subjection and the monarch who, after leading his army in 2 victorious campaigns and doubling the extent of his country, did not hesitate to sacrifice his crown to save his people from disaster. Henceforth, even in minds not prone to superstition, the two events were linked by the same date. The mourning for the one rekindled the memory of the other, and King Constantine acquired a new and imperishable title to the gratitude of the nation. If all the efforts made in the past to blast his glory or to belittle his services had only heightened his popularity, all the efforts made since to blot out his image could only engrave it still deeper in the hearts of the people. His very exile was interpreted, symbolically, as the enchanted sleep whence he would arise to fulfill the ancient prophecies. Mysticism apart, during the sad period preceding his departure, the affection of the masses for their sovereign, intensified by compassion, had assumed the quality of veneration. Now that he was gone, they brooded over the wrongs which had driven him, a lawful and popular king, into exile, wrongs which suffered for their sakes enhanced his claims on their loyalty. They remembered wistfully the splendor of his victories, his manly courage, his saintly patience, and perhaps most of all, his unfailing kindness to the humble and the weak. This was the quality which drew men most strongly to Constantine, and the absence of which repelled them most from Mr. Venizelos. The experience of the last 3 years had helped them to emphasize the contrast. When the eagle's son was up above, there were few vultures in the land. Now there were vultures only. So the name of Constantine became a synonym for orderly government. Loyalty to his person was identified with the principle of liberty, and the people who had never regarded Alexander as anything more than a regent, who cried after the departing monarch from the shore of Oropus, "You shall come back to us soon," hailed the return to normality as presaging the return of the legitimate sovereign as well as of a legal constitution. This, however, was the very last thing the powers that were contemplated even as a remote potentiality. For them the monarch in exile was dead, and the sooner his memory was buried, the better. Accordingly, a police circular issued on 26 May prohibited conversations favorable to the ex-king, pictures of the ex-king, songs in honor of the ex-king, cheers for the ex-king, and these regulations having been found insufficient to curb royalist fervor, 5 days later Mr. Venizelos demanded and obtained from Parliament the re-establishment of martial law on the ground that talk about the return of the ex-king was calculated to excite public feeling, and then the opposition might have cause to blame the government for not respecting the freedom of elections. The question of the ex-king, he argued, was utterly irrelevant to the forthcoming contest. The people would not be called upon to elect a constituent, but merely a revisionist assembly. Who has said that there is to be a constituent assembly? He asked. The answer, of course, was easy. He himself had said so on his installation in 1917. But lapses of memory are permissible to statesmen who mean business. Mr. Venizelos wanted a National Assembly which would have powers to ratify the dethronement of the king, the suspension of the irremovability of judges, and all other revolutionary illegalities, besides perhaps altering fundamental articles of the Constitution, such as the right of the Crown to appoint and dismiss ministers and to dissolve parliaments, powers which essentially belong to a constituent assembly. But he wanted it to be merely revisionist. The paradox made havoc of his logic, but in no way affected his purpose, which was that, while as constituent in its nature, the assembly should effect any alterations in the government of the country that he desired, as revisionist in name it would not be competent to discuss the restoration of the king, and, if it proved recalcitrant, would be subject to dissolution by the executive. Consistency and Mr. Venizelos had been divorced long ago, and the decree was now to be made absolute. While these eccentricities prevailed at home, abroad the gamester spirit of the Cretan scored its crowning triumph. By the Treaty of Seber, 10 August 1920, which embodied the territorial arrangements already made at San Remo, Greece obtained practically the whole of Thrace outside the enclave of Constantinople and a mandate of Smyrna and its hinterland. No doubt this enormous extension of the kingdom, though still largely problematical, appealed to that compound of idealism and greed, mostly greed, which constitutes Hellenic, as it does all other imperialism. But it did not fully compensate for the suppression of popular liberties within its frontiers. Except among the followers of Mr. Venizelos, the national aggrandizement evoked but little enthusiasm. What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Wrote one of the opposition leaders, voicing a widespread sentiment, a sentiment which, only 2 days after the publication of the treaty, 12 August, found sinister expression. As he was about to leave Paris, Mr. Venizelos was shot at and slightly wounded by 2 Greek ex-officers. The assailants, on being arrested, declared that their object had been to free Greece from its oppressor and to ensure freedom for their fellow citizens. The party's outrage had a sequel at Athens, as significant and more tragic. The followers of Mr. Venizelos, like those of King Constantine, included a set of fanatics who preached that the salvation of the country demanded the extirpation of their adversaries. To these zealots, the moment seemed propitious for putting their doctrine into practice. "Hellenes," cried one of their journals, "our great chief, our great patriot, the man who has made Greece great and prosperous, the man who has made us proud to be called Greeks, has been murdered by the instruments of the ex-king. Hellenes, rise up, all of you, and drive the murderers out of the fatherland." The Hellenes in general remained unmoved, but some gangs of hooligans did rise up, 13 August, and under the eyes of the police and the gendarmerie, wrecked a number of royalist newspaper offices, clubs, cafes, and sacked the houses of 4 prominent anti-Venizelist statesmen. The authorities underside had a dozen leaders of opposition groups thrown into prison, and, pending their conviction, Mr. Ripulis, a minister who, in the absence of Mr. Venizelos, acted as his deputy, declared that the attempt of the premier formed part of a plot long planned for the overthrow of the regime. It had failed, but the heads of the culprits would fall without fail. In fact, one of the opposition leaders, Ion Dragoumis, son of the ex-premier in that name, was assassinated by the Cretan guards who had arrested him. The others, after being kept in solitary confinement for 24 days, had to be released for want of any incriminating evidence. Mr. Venizelos, in Paris, when he heard of the riots, was reported as being beside himself with righteous indignation, and he sent a strongly worded telegram to the government, expressing the fear that part of the responsibility for the disorders rested upon its organs, and assuring it that he should exact full account from everyone concerned. But when he returned home, he publicly embraced Mr. Ripulis, who explained in the chamber, to the entire satisfaction of his chief, that the government had been overawed and very nearly overthrown by the extremists in its own ranks. 8 September. Everything that could be done, short of a massacre, to disorganize and to intimidate the opposition having been done, martial law was suspended, 7 September, and the question of elections began to engage Mr. Venizelos' attention seriously. It was a trial which involved his political life or death, and therefore required the utmost care and vigilance. One ill-considered step, one omission on his part, might send him to his doom. He began with the enfranchisement of Thrace, 9 September. This province, still under military occupation and martial law, was to vote. Further, a political frontier was erected between it and the rest of Greece, which only those possessing a special pass could cross, whilst a rigorous censorship kept all anti-Venizelos newspapers out of it. And lastly, it was enacted, for the benefit of an electorate alien in its majority and unable to read or write Greek, that the Thracian votes, contrary to the general rule, should be polled by ballot paper instead of by a ball. Another bill enabled the army on active service for the first time in the history of Greece to participate in elections, the assumption being that among the soldiers Venizelos feeling predominated, or that at all events they would be controlled by their officers. An exceptional importance has always attached to the district and city of Athens, which Mr. Venizelos said symbolizes the very soul of the country. It was incumbent upon him to pay special attention to this area. The difficulty was that the actual population was notoriously unsympathetic. Mr. Venizelos hastened to overcome this difficulty by 3 strokes of the pen. 18,000 refugees from all parts who lived on the Ministry of Public Relief were enrolled as Athenian citizens. To this were added some 6,000 Cretan gendarmes and policemen, and, to make up the deficiency, 15,000 natives of Smyrna, supposed to have earned Greek citizenship by volunteering in the war, had their names inscribed on the electoral lists of Attica. There followed promises and warnings. On the one hand, the people were promised fresh labor legislation, the conversion of the great landed estates into small holdings, and public works on a large scale. On the other hand, they were warned that an adverse vote from them would have disastrous consequences for the country. Greece had been aggrandized by the Allies for the sake of Mr. Venizelos. If she discarded him, she would forfeit their goodwill and her territorial acquisitions. But Mr. Venizelos and his partisans did not trust altogether to the practical sense and the imperialist sensibilities of the people. For months past, the extremists among his followers openly threatened that, if by any mishap Venizelos did not win the day after all, they would make a coup d'etat and strike terror into the hearts of their adversaries. This threat, which primarily presented itself as an extravagance of irresponsible fanaticism, was on 7 September officially espoused by Mr. Venizelos, who declared in Parliament that, should perchance his adversaries obtain a majority in the new assembly, and should that assembly decide to convoke a constituent assembly, and should this constituent assembly invite King Constantine back, the reaction would find itself confronted with the hostility of a large political party which had become the mortal enemy of the ex-king, and he went on to foreshadow a fresh schism in the army, that is, civil war. Encouraged by so solemn a sanction, Venizelos' candidates, notably at Ternabo in Thessaly and Dervinion in Argolis, told their constituents without any circumlocution that, in the event of a defeat at the polls, the government would not surrender its power, but would maintain it through the Army of National Defense, which was pledged to a new revolution. The parliamentary system would cease to function even in name, and many a malignant would swing. These appeals to the sovereign people, published in the Royalist and not contradicted by the Venizelos press, will doubtless seem startling for a government whose mission was to establish democratic liberties. But they were justified by necessity. Mr. Venizelos and his partisans could not afford to be very fastidious. Their political existence was at stake. They must make every effort and summon every resource at their command. Anyone who was in Athens at that time and saw the Cretan guards, often with the premier's photograph pinned on their breasts, assault such citizens as displayed the olive twig, emblem of the opposition, or saw the gendarmes who patrolled the streets with fixed bayonets protect the excesses of Venizelos' bravos, would appreciate how far the government was prepared to stoop in order to survive. In the midst of these electoral activities, King Alexander died of blood poisoning caused by the bite of a pet monkey. Alive, he had neither exercised nor been wanted to exercise any influence over the destinies of his country. He had simply played the part required by the caste in which a whimsical fortune had placed him. His death proved of more importance, inasmuch as it forced the question of the throne upon Mr. Venizelos irresistibly. The vacancy had to be filled. Anxious to perpetuate the comedy, Mr. Venizelos sought a successor in a still younger and less experienced scion of the dynasty, Prince Paul, a lad in his teens, who refused the offer on the ground that, until his father and his eldest brother renounced their rights, he could not lawfully ascend the throne. After threatening to change the dynasty rather than admit any discussion on the restoration of King Constantine, Mr. Venizelos, by one of those swift turns characteristic of him, suddenly made that restoration the main issue of the elections. He challenged the opposition to this test of the real wishes of the Greek people. The Greek people, he said, should be given the chance of deciding whether they will have Constantine back, and if it so decided, he himself would go. The opposition, which consisted of no fewer than 16 different groups, united only by a common desire to get rid of the Cretan dictator, would fain decline the challenge. Some of the leaders were ardent royalists, others were very lukewarm ones, and others still could hardly be described as royalists at all. Generally speaking, the politicians out of office had found in the cause of Constantine a national badge for the party feud. Moreover, they realized that the question of Constantine possessed an international as well as a national aspect, and they did not wish to compromise the future of Greece and their own, which would have been nothing else than stepping into the very pit Mr. Venizelos had dug for them. But neither could they repudiate Constantine without losing popular support. To the Greek people, the main issue of the fight was indeed what Mr. Venizelos made it. At length the day of trial arrived. A Sunday, 14 November, a day of leisure in a land of universal suffrage. From an early hour, people of all classes thronged the polling stations quietly. They had clamored for a chance of expressing their sentiments, yet now that the chance had come, they took it with an extraordinary composure. Even to the most expert eye, the electors' demeanor gave no indication of their sentiments. The olive twig had very curiously withered out of sight, nor did the behavior of the voters in the last 3 years afford any clue to the use they would make of their present opportunity. Greeks are part masters of simulation and dissimulation. Openly some might have pretended friendship to the Venizelos regime from hopes of favor, others again dissembled hostility through fear, but the voting was secret. Both government and opposition shared the suspense, though the government anticipated an overwhelming majority. Note: even if the opposition sweeps the Peloponnese and gains a majority in Acarnania and Corfu, it is still doubtful whether it will have 120 seats in the new chamber, which will contain 369 deputies, and the Venizelists anticipate that their opponents will emerge from the struggle with less than 100 deputies. The Times, 15 November 1920. End of note. Which was natural enough, since all the advantage seemed on its side. Presently the votes were counted, and it was officially announced that the government had been mistaken in its anticipations. The magnitude of the mistake appeared on the publication of the figures. 250 seats to 118. The Royalists had swept the polls, to the astonishment of all parties, including their own. Note: the Daily Mail, the Evening News, 16 November 1920, Reuter, Athens, 15 November. Not a single Venizelist was returned for Macedonia and all Greece except in Epirus and Aegean Islands. End of note. The very men who had fought at the bidding of Mr. Venizelos had pronounced themselves against them. Having fulfilled their duty as soldiers, they vindicated their right to live as free citizens. His own constituency had rejected him, and would the rout stop there? Among the millions who had submitted to his rule with sullen irritation, there were many whose hearts swelled with rage, in whom all wounds rankled and festered. Might not these men now have recourse to other weapons than the boot in order to get even with the bully? For a moment, Mr. Venizelos felt stupefied. The edifice that had seemed so solid was collapsing about him, and he was in danger of being buried under the ruins. Then he wisely stole out of the country he had done his best to aggrandize and to disintegrate. Note: we learn that his followers urged upon him the advisability of a coup d'etat. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to carry out, and with so much at stake for Greece and for democratic principles generally, it seemed justifiable. Mr. Venizelos at Nice, in The Times, 29 November 1920. But fears are entertained, it is said, that the regular army, which is strongly anti-Venizelist, may get out of hand. The Daily Mail, 17 November. End of note. The result of the elections was virtually an invitation to King Constantine to return and resume his crown. But the king, not content with an indirect verdict, wanted an explicit plebiscite ad hoc clear of all other issues. The Allies, after a conference in London, telegraphed 2 December to Mr. Rallis, the new Greek premier, that they had no wish to interfere in the internal affairs of Greece, but they felt bound to declare publicly that the restoration of the throne to a king whose disloyal attitude and conduct towards the Allies during the war caused them great embarrassment and loss could only be regarded by them as a ratification by Greece of his hostile acts. Note: the terms of the note were communicated to the House of Commons by Mr. Bonar the same night. End of note. This message, yet another fruit of Franco-British compromise, was followed up 6 December by a second note enumerating the consequences, political and financial, of the Powers' displeasure, but it produced little effect. Out of the 1,013,724 electors who took part in the plebiscite 7 December, only 10,383 voted against the king. Mr. Rallis, in acquainting him with the result, stated that he considered it tantamount to a formal request from the country to the sovereign to come into his own again, and invited him to respond to the clearly expressed wish of the nation, which King Constantine did, nothing loth. Few of those who witnessed the event will ever forget it. On the eve of the king's return, 18th December, Athens could scarcely contain her emotion. All day long, her beflagged streets rang with the cry, "Archetai! Archetai! He is coming! He is coming!" Hardly anybody failed to utter it, and nobody dared to say, "Then Archetai!" He is not coming, even if referring to an unpunctual friend. At night, the song in which Constantine was alluded to as the son of the eagle echoed from one end of the illuminated city to the other, but this was only a preparation for next morning's welcome. Owing to stress of weather, the cruiser carrying the king and queen of the Hellenes was compelled to put in at Corinth, where the exiles landed. From that point to the capital their journey was a triumphal progress. The train moved slowly between lines of peasants who, their hands linked, accompanied it shouting, "We have wanted him! We have brought him back!" Note: another version of this refrain, which might be seen in crude lettering over the cafe at Phaleron, is, "So we willed it, and we brought him back. Et situ ethalame, kaiton pharamein," a distinct expression of the feeling that the people, by bringing back its sovereign in the face of foreign opposition, asserted its own sovereignty. End of note. When the king stepped out of the station, officers fought a way to the carriage with blue and silver-dressed postilions, which waited for him and the queen. He had to keep tossing from one hand to the other his baton, as men and women pressed upon him for a handshake. The carriage struggled forward, men and women clinging to its steps and running with it, trying to kiss the hands and feet of the royal pair, and, baulked of this, kissing even the horses and the carriage itself. All the way, dense masses of people pressed around the carriage, shouting, "He has come!" or singing the chorus, "Again our king will draw the sword." An eyewitness had a vision of a soldier who, amid cries of, "We will die for you, godfather," clambered into the carriage head first and fell to kissing the knees of the king and queen, while around some people fainted and stretchers pressed through the crowd. And so the fight for the soul of Greece ended in a victory for Constantine. The character of this prince has been painted in the most opposite colors, as must always be the case when a man becomes the object of fervent worship and bitter enmity. But the bare record of what he did and endured reveals him sufficiently. His qualities speak through his actions, so that he who runs may read. His most conspicuous defect was a want of suppleness, a certain rigidity of spirit which, when he succeeded, was called firmness, and when he failed, obstinacy. Yet the charge so often brought against him, that he allowed himself to be misled by evil counselors, shows that this persistence in his own opinion did not spring from egoism, nor was incompatible with deference to the opinions of others. It arose from a deep sense of responsibility. He stubbornly refused to deviate from his course when he believed that his duty to his country forbade deviation, and he readily laid down his crown when duty to his country dictated renunciation. For the rest, a man who never bows to his contemporaries may confidently leave his character to the judgment of posterity. As for Mr. Venizelos, history will probably say of him what it is said of Themistocles. Though he sincerely aimed at the aggrandizement of his country, and proved on some most critical occasions of great value to it, yet on the whole his intelligence was higher than his morality, a man of many talents and few principles, ready to employ the most tortuous and unscrupulous means, sometimes indeed for ends in themselves patriotic, but often merely for aggrandizing himself. By nature he was more fitted to rule in a despotic than to lead a constitutional state. He had been born an emperor. His fertile genius might, unless betrayed by his restless ambition, have rendered his reign prosperous and his memory precious. As it is, in his career, with all his brilliance, posterity will find not so much a pattern to imitate as an example to deter. End of section 23. Section 24 of Greece and the Allies by George Frederick Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mario Pineda. Afterword. In default of a providence whose intervention in human affairs is no longer recognized, there is still a nemesis of history whose operations can scarcely be denied. International morality, strange as the juxtaposition of the two words may seem, exists no less than the law of gravity, and a statesman who offends against the one must expect much the same catastrophe as an engineer who ignores the other. But it is not often that this law of retribution asserts itself so swiftly as it has done in the drama for which Greece supplied the stage to French statesmen during the last few years, for it is not often that a government in the pursuit of practical interests overlooks so completely moral principles, flouts so openly national sentiments, and, while priding itself on realism, shuts its eyes so consistently to realities. The logic of French action is as above reproach, as its motives are beyond dispute. 9 decades ago, the Duke of Broglie clearly explained that the aim of France in assisting to liberate Greece from the Turkish yoke was to have in the eastern Mediterranean an instrument of her own ambition, a state disposed to turn her eyes constantly towards that power who has made her free, to watch for us over the ports of the Levant, to guard with us the mouth of the Black Sea and the gates of the Bosphorus, transcriber's note Bosporus. It followed that the greater the client, the better for the patron's purpose. After undergoing many fluctuations and modifications, this idea was revived at the time of the Balkan Wars, when France, together with Germany, supported the Greek claim to Kavala, and it was fostered to an unhealthy growth during the European War. Hence the identification of France with Mr. Venizelos, who stood for the policy of expansion at all hazards, and her hostility to King Constantine, who, preferring safety to hazardous ventures, stood for Greece's right to shape her course without dictation from Paris any more than from Berlin. By the methods which she employed, France succeeded in gaining Greece and losing the Greeks. Nothing else could have been expected. Friends are sometimes to be won by good offices, sometimes by the promise of good offices, and sometimes by good words. They are seldom won by injuries, and by insults never. It is curious that so elementary a lesson in human nature should have been unknown to the able man who guided the policy and diplomacy of France during the war, who raised her military prestige and re-established her position in the first rank of the European powers. Yet it is a fact which can be easily verified by a reference to their utterances. They are upon record. Brute force, and again brute force. Such is the burden that runs through them all, and it embodies a doctrine. The Greeks are Orientals and must be wooed with terror, on the notion enunciated by an English humorist as a paradox and adopted by a French statesman as an axiom, that terror sown in the Oriental heart will yield a harvest of esteem, even of affection. With this mad dogma nailed to her mast, France set out upon her voyage for the conquest of the Hellenic heart. It was the first of her mistakes, and it was accompanied by another, Even if Greece were willing to play the part of a French satellite, she could not do so, for her geographical situation exposes her to the influence of more than one power. Italy, who has her own ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean, opposed during the war a policy the object of which was Greek expansion over territories coveted by herself and a readjustment of the balance of forces in favor of France, and it was partly in order not to alienate Italy during the war that French statesmen wanted Greece to come in without any specified conditions, leaving the matter of territorial compensations for the time of settlement. Russia showed itself not less suspicious of French diplomacy for similar reasons. But it was with England chiefly that France had to reckon. In the past, the rivalry between France and England in the eastern Mediterranean, though often overshadowed by their common antagonism, first to Russia and subsequently to Germany, was a perennial cause of discord, which kept Greece oscillating between the two powers. During the war, England, of necessity, lent France her acquiescence and even assistance in a work which she would rather not have seen done. But once done, she endeavored to secure such profit as was to be derived therefrom. The Greeks in Asia Minor, it was thought, could serve to check the Turks from troubling us in Mesopotamia and other parts of the Near and Middle East. Hence the Treaty of Sevres, which provided for the aggrandizement of Greece at the expense of the Ottoman Empire in Asia as well as in Europe, to the seeming satisfaction of both French and British interests. But the adjustment, even if it had been forced upon Turkey, could, by the nature of things, be only temporary. Owing to her geographical situation, Greece must inevitably move within the orbit of the power who dominates the sea. Psychology accelerated the movement imposed by geography. While France based her action upon an English humorist's paradox, England based hers upon a French thinker's maxim. Lorsqu'on veut redoubler de force, il faut redoubler de grâce. Although her diplomatic, military, and naval representatives did participate in every measure of coercion and intimidation as a matter of policy, they, if we accept the Secret Service gentry, never forgot the dictates of decency. They never, figuratively, kicked the person whom they deemed it necessary to knock down. The ordinary British soldiers, too, for all the relaxation of moral rules natural in war, maintained throughout the campaign a standard of behavior which contrasted so favorably with their comrades that it earned them among the inhabitants of Macedonia the honorable nickname of the Maids. It was particularly noted during the fire which devastated Salonika that, while others took advantage of the turmoil to loot, the British soldier devoted himself wholly to rescuing. Some of these things were perhaps resented by our allies as weak, and some were ridiculed as naive, but they must be judged by their effect. At the end of the war, one nation was respected by the Greeks as much as the other was hated and despised. British prestige rose exactly in proportion as French prestige sank, and the object which France elected to seek and sought in vain by means of violence and terror, England attained by a conduct which, if not mere lawful, was much more graceful. Still, French statesmen counted on Mr. Venizelos, l'homme politique qui incarnait l'idée de la solidarité des intérêts français et grecs, to keep his country on their side. And as in the first instance they had made the alliance conditional on his being placed in control, so now they made the benefits accruing from it to Greece dependent on his remaining in control. That Mr. Venizelos could not always remain in control does not seem to have occurred to them, nor that he might not always be content to be a mere puppet in their hands. Murmurs at his pro-British learnings were indeed heard occasionally, but on the whole the Cretan possessed in an adequate measure the faculty of adapting himself to rival points of view, of making each power feel that her interests were supreme in his regard, and of using the ambitions of both to promote his own. As long as he remained in control, France, with whatever reservations, felt sure of her share of influence. The collapse of Mr. Venizelos and the demand of the Greek people for King Constantine's return came to French statesmen as a painful surprise. That they had for several years been laboriously building on illusions could not be disguised, and being made to look absurd before those of their own compatriots who had all along advocated a policy based on the preservation and exploitation of Turkey, rendered the situation doubly awkward. Unable to rise above personal pique, they would fain veto the return of a prince whom they hated and whom they had wronged beyond hope of conciliation. England, however, free from petty animosities and sensible that, under whatever ruler Greece would be with her, refused to sanction lawlessness in the midst of peace, and her view that, if the Greeks wanted Constantine, it was their business and not ours, prevailed. But on the other hand, by way of compromise, France obtained that he should return to an empty treasury with foreign credits cut off and the loans made by the Allies to the Venizelos government to facilitate the waging of a common war against Turkey revoked. It was an impossible position which King Constantine was called upon to face, a position none of his own making, yet one from which there was no retreat. The Greek people's imperialism had been roused. The leaders who once criticized Mr. Venizelos' Asiatic policy as a dangerous dream, opposed to economic, strategic, and ethnic realities, might still hold those views, and muttered in secret that Smyrna would prove the grave of Greece, but they no longer dared express them out of deference to public opinion. To the masses, Mr. Venizelos' wild game of chance seemed vindicated by its results, and while they rejected the man, they clung to his work. The Greek government had no choice but to carry on the conflict under enormous disadvantages. As France anticipated, with foreign credits cut off and a progressive fall in the exchange, the expense of maintaining a large army on a war footing proved too heavy for the national exchequer. And that was not the worst. France, who since the armistice had betrayed a keen jealousy of England's place in a part of the world in which she claimed special rights, presently concluded a separate agreement with Turkey, an example in which she was followed by Italy, and gave the Turks her moral and material support in their struggle with the Greeks, while England, though refusing to reverse her policy in favor of their enemies, contented herself with giving the Greeks only a platonic encouragement which they were unwise enough to take for more than it was worth. Everyone knows the melancholy sequel. Our unhappy allies, left to their own exhausted resources, were driven from the Asiatic territories which in common prudence they should never have entered, and the overseas empire which Mr. Venizelos had conjured up vanished in smoke. The rout in Asia Minor had its repercussions in Greece. For nearly 2 years the people, though war-worn and on the edge of bankruptcy, bore the financial as they had borne the famine blockade, trusting that England would at any moment come forth to counter the vindictiveness of France, and sturdily resisted all the efforts of the Venizelos party to shake the stability of the royalist regime. Constantine again appeared in their eyes as a victim of the Cretan's intrigues. But the loss of Ionia and the danger of the loss of Thrace, the horror and despair arising from the sack of Smyrna, whence shiploads of broken refugees fled to the Greek ports, all these, reinforced by an idea that the maintenance of the king on the throne prevented the effective expression of British friendship, and his fall would remove French hostility, created conditions before which questions of personality for once faded into insignificance, and put into the hands of Mr. Venizelos' partisans an irresistible lever. On 26 September, an army of 15,000 insurgent soldiers landed near Athens and demanded the abdication of the king. The loyal troops were ready to meet force by force, but the king, in order to avert a fratricidal struggle which would have dealt Greece the finishing stroke, forbade opposition and immediately abdicated, happy, as he said, that another opportunity had been given me to sacrifice myself once more for Greece. In fact, once more Constantine was made the scapegoat for disasters for which he was in no way responsible, disasters from which he would undoubtedly have saved his country had he been allowed to pursue his own sober course. Mr. Venizelos would not go back to Athens until the excitement subsided, lest the people should think, he said, that he had had any part in the revolution, but undertook the defense of the national interests in the Entente capitals. His mission was to obtain such support as would enable him to save Greece something out of the ruin which his insane imperialism had brought upon her, so that he might be in a position to point out to his countrymen that he alone, after the disastrous failure of Constantine, had been able to secure their partial rehabilitation. That accomplished, he might then hope to become a perpetual prime minister or president. France made it quite clear that no changes in Greece could alter her policy, however satisfied she might be at the second disappearance of the antipathetic monarch. It should not be supposed that, even were a republic to be set up, presided over by the great Cretan, her attitude on territorial questions would be transformed. Thrace, after Ionia, must revert to Turkey. French statesmen longed for the complete demolition of their own handiwork. Monsieur Poincaré, in 1922, was proud to do what the Duke of Broglie, 90 years before, scoffed at as an unthinkable folly. Abandonner la race aujourd'hui, détruite de nos propres, mais l'ouvrage que nos propres mains ont achevé. England's expressed attitude was not characterized by a like precision. It is true that after the Greek debacle, she dispatched ships and troops to prevent the straits from falling into the hands of the Turks, but in the matter of Thrace she had already yielded to France, and how the restoration of Turkish rule in Europe can be reconciled with the freedoms of the Straits remains to be seen. What the future may have in store for Greece and Turkey is a matter of comparatively small account. What is of great and permanent importance is the divergence between the paths of France and England revealed by the preceding analysis of events. From this analysis have been carefully excluded such superficial dissensions as always arise between allies after a war, and were especially to be expected after a war in which every national susceptibility was quickened to a morbid degree. They belong to a different category from the profound antagonisms under consideration. These, whatever the philosopher may think of a struggle for domination, present a problem which British statesmen must face frankly. It is not a new problem, but it now appears under a new form and in a more acute phase than it has ever possessed in the past, thanks to the success of the knockout blow policy which governed the later stages of the war. With the German power replaced by the French, the Russian for the moment in abeyance, French and Italian influences competing in Turkey, French and British aims clashing in the Arab regions wrested from Turkey, while indignation at Occidental interference surges in the minds of all the peoples of the Orient, the Eastern Mediterranean offers a situation which tempts one to ask whether the authors of that policy have not succeeded too well, whether in pursuing the success of the day, to which their personal reputations were attached, did they not lose sight of the morrow, whether they have not scattered the seed without sufficiently heeding the crop. However that may be, unless this situation was clearly foreseen by its creators and provided for, a hypothesis which, with the utmost goodwill towards them, does not appear very probable, they have an anxious task, a task that, under these conditions, demands from British statesmen more thinking about the new Eastern question and the Greek factor in it that was necessary before 1914. As a first aid to an appreciation of the problem by the public, which the present crisis found utterly unprepared, it would have been well if the fundamental differences between the respective attitudes of France and England towards each other and towards the peoples concerned had been candidly acknowledged, and all pretense of Franco-British cooperation in the Near East abandoned. Lasting cooperation cannot be where there is neither community of interests nor consonance of ideas, where the loss of one party is welcome as gained by the other, and the wisdom of the one in the eyes of the other is folly. Pious talk of a common allied mission in the Near East has only served to obscure issues and to render confusion in the public mind worse confounded. It was idle to make a mystery of the support given by France to the Turks and of her insistence on the revision of the severed treaty, preliminary steps to her demand for the evacuation of Chanak and the consequent elimination of British sea power. The object of these tactics was evident to every serious student of history. France pursues now the plan laid down by Louis XIV, continued by Napoleon, fitfully carried on throughout the 19th century, and facilitated by her installation in Syria, the equivalent of the German Drang nach Osten, a plan incompatible with the safety of the British Empire in the East. This is the truth of the matter, and nothing has been gained by hiding it. The people who fought a ruinous war without quite knowing the ends aimed at had a right to know at least the results obtained, and after France's separate agreement with Turkey, the denial to them of any part of that knowledge could not be justified on any principle of honor or plea of expediency. End of section 24. End of Greece and the Allies by George Frederick Abbott.